Before we begin the video, if you've been getting value out of this channel, please consider supporting High Americana via Patreon, linked in the description. At $3,000 a month, you will help me make this a full-time job and can also request historical content to be made. Thank you. And now, a passage from Americans in Eastern Asia, a critical study of the policy of the United States with reference to China, Japan, and Korea in the 19th century, from Chapter 15, The Policy of Dr. Peter Parker, Formosa. Dr. Peter Parker had arrived in China in 1834 as a medical missionary under the auspices of the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. He was a native of Massachusetts, had been a student at Amherst College, and had been graduated at Yale in 1831. He studied theology at Yale Divinity School and then took a course in medicine in Philadelphia. He opened the ophthalmic hospital at Canton the year after his arrival, and thus became the founder of medical missions in China. The hospital won the support of Hong merchants and foreigners alike, and Dr. Parker, who was of amiable disposition, became a very popular and trusted person. He was a member of the Morrison expedition to Japan and was in Washington in 1840 when the first discussions with reference to the Anglo-Chinese War took place. He married a distant relative of Daniel Webster's while on this visit to the United States, thus forming an alliance which made his entrance into government service especially easy. He acted as one of the interpreters for Caleb Cushing in 1844, and the next year he was appointed Chinese secretary and interpreter to the newly created legation. Dr. Parker thus became the one element of continuity in the diplomatic relations of the United States with China during the many replacements and resignations of the following 10 years, and he was at length appointed, September 1855, commissioner. He was the only commissioner or minister ever appointed to China who could speak, read, or write the Chinese language. And with two exceptions, he was the only person ever appointed by way of promotion from a subordinate position in the diplomatic service in China. Dr. Parker's service, which lasted less than 2 years, was characterized by three objects: the accomplishment of the revision of the Cushing Treaty, the achievement of an entente cordiale with Great Britain and France for the pursuit of a cooperative policy, and the acquisition of the island of Formosa for the United States. Treaty revision. Destruction of barrier forts. The time for the revision of the treaty falling legally due in 1856, Dr. Parker was supplied with full powers to conduct the negotiations and was instructed to seek to obtain three concessions. 1. Residence for a diplomatic officer at Peking. 2. Unlimited extension of trade. 3. The removal of every restriction to personal liberty. So much impressed was the American government in the face of the steady opposition of the Chinese to all reform, and even to full compliance with the treaties, with the necessity of cooperation with the other treaty powers, that Dr. Parker was authorized to proceed to his post by way of London and Paris, and to confer with Lord Clarendon and with the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs with a view to the adoption of a common policy in China. He was, however, entirely without authority to do more than have conversations. The Commissioner's enthusiasm for common action may have been a little misleading to the British and the French, encouraging them to expect in the way of cooperation very much more than the government of the United States was prepared to give. Of an interview with Lord Clarendon, October 26, 1855, Dr. Parker reported, "I remarked that it being the desire of the United States government that the same concurrent policy and action which hitherto had so happily characterized the three powers in China should continue, I was solicitous to see his lordship on the subject." In the conclusion of the interview, Clarendon remarked, "I shall have great pleasure on the opening of Parliament to speak of the Triple Alliance." Parker himself was thoroughly in favor of such a formal arrangement. In Paris, the American commissioner had a similar interview at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and then set out for China, where he arrived in December 1855. He was determined to take high ground in securing the new treaty, but Commissioner Ye continued his insolent, unbending attitude and even refused to hold an interview with Parker. The American commissioner demanded and threatened, but in vain. To Sir John Bowring and to the French representative, Parker proposed joint energetic action, but his program and his methods did not commend themselves to either of these gentlemen. Parker had apparently not made a very good impression in either London or Paris. The British, at least, had determined to proceed slowly, and run no risk of a second rebuff such as had been administered to Bowring and Maclean at the mouth of the Pai Ho in 1854. Having failed to see the viceroy at Canton, Parker proceeded to Foochow, where he was able to hold an interview with the governor-general, to whom he entrusted for delivery at Peking the letter from the president to the emperor which contained the request for treaty revision. Some weeks later this letter was returned to the commissioner, the seals broken, and with other marks of careless handling and of disrespect. Parker was directed to present the letter to Viceroy Ye for transmission to Peking. The return of the letter Parker regarded as a national insult, and he would have proceeded to the mouth of the Pai Ho in a war vessel to demand explanations as well as to open treaty negotiations had not an accident to the San Jacinto deprived him of a means of conveyance. In the latter part of October, Admiral Seymour, British, had breached the walls of Canton as a result of the unwillingness of Ye to make the required amends for an alleged insult to the British flag in the Arrow affair, and for a few hours had occupied the Viceroy's yamen. During the early part of November, a state of intermittent warfare was maintained. At the request of Ye, who declared that he could no longer protect the foreigners of neutral nations, the Americans decided to withdraw from Canton. As Commander Foote of the American Navy was on his way up to Canton on the 15th of November to escort the Americans down the river, he was fired on by the barrier forts which, upon the withdrawal of the British, had been reoccupied by the Chinese. The next day, Commodore James Armstrong, commanding officer of the American naval forces on the China station, ordered the destruction of the barrier forts, and within the next 2 days this was accomplished. This action was hailed with delight not only by the Americans but by the English as well, for it seemed to indicate that at last the government of the United States would be compelled to adopt towards China a more energetic policy. Ye did not fail to see the danger of the situation, and on the 5th of December rendered a complete apology. Greatly stirred by these events, as well as stung by the rebuffs of the Chinese authorities and the recollections of being called for more than 20 years a foreign devil, Dr. Parker addressed to Marcy a comprehensive dispatch, December 12, 1856, in which he offered the most extensive program yet proposed for the settlement of the affairs of the treaty powers in China. He suggested, were the 3 representatives of England, France, and America, on presenting themselves at the Pai Ho, in case of their not being welcome to Peking, to say, the French flag will be hoisted in Korea, the English again at Chusan, and the United States in Formosa, and there remain till satisfaction for the past, and a right understanding for the future are granted, but, being granted, these possessions shall instantly be restored, negotiation would no longer be obstructed, and the most advantageous and desirable results to all concerned secured. He admitted that such a novel program should be undertaken only as a last resort. The events, as well as the recommendations of Dr. Parker for the occupation of Chinese territory, were very disquieting to President Pierce and Secretary of State Marcy. There had been reported in the London papers another incident in connection with the occupation of Canton, which was equally disturbing. It was stated that the American consul at Hong Kong, James Keenan, had not only been present with the attacking British forces at Canton, but that he had actually carried the American flag over the wall into the city. No mention of this event had been made in the official reports to the Department of State. The President, while withholding severe censure from Commodore Armstrong, did regard the sending of the boat, the San Jacinto, to make soundings near the forts at a time of so much disturbance as not a discreet act. From a cursory reading of the documents which had been received, wrote Marcy to Parker, I think he is inclined to regret that there had not been more caution on the part of our naval force in the beginning and more forbearance in the subsequent steps. The British government evidently has objects beyond those contemplated by the United States, and we ought not to be drawn along with it, however anxious it may be for our cooperation. The President sincerely hopes that you, as well as our naval commander, will be able to do all that is required for the defense of American citizens and the protection of their property without being included in the British quarrel or producing any serious disturbance in our amicable relations with China. As for the indiscretion of Consul Keenan, provided the reports in the London papers were correct, Dr. Parker was instructed to transmit to the consul a letter removing him from office. Keenan denied Parker's authority and was never removed. Those were the closing days of the Pierce administration, and the government was disinclined to mark out a policy in China for the succeeding administration. Dr. Parker was left without further specific instructions as to treaty revision, and the rumor that he was to be superseded had already reached him. His impatient efforts to place in the crown of the present administration the laurel of establishing the United States legation at Peking and the material extension of American commerce with China had come to nothing except the near approach to the gravest of entanglements in the Far East. Dr. Parker, however, found much to occupy his attention in the effort to establish an American protectorate over Formosa. An American protectorate for Formosa. There were three possible sources from which coal for the proposed Trans-Pacific steamship line might be secured: Japan, the mainland of China, or Formosa. Of these three, Formosa had in point of time been the first to draw the attention of the American authorities in China. In 1847, officers of both the British and the American Navy made surveys of the coal resources of Formosa. Some samples of the coal were sent to the Navy Department for analysis, and at about the same time, the Peninsula and Oriental Steamship Company contracted with residents of Formosa for 7,000 tons of coal at $7 a ton. Only about 300 tons were ever delivered. The Chinese government became alarmed at the interest the foreigners were taking in the island and took possession of the mines, placing obstructions in the way of exporting coal to Hong Kong. In July 1849, the U.S. brig Dolphin, Captain Ogden, made an expedition to Keelung, Formosa, for further explorations. Captain Ogden was strongly dissuaded by the magistrate from visiting the mines, and he contented himself with securing some samples for analysis. The Chinese Repository, July 1849, in a report of this expedition, stated that the coal seemed to be better than that which was brought out from Liverpool. The editor remarked, "The existence of coal at this accessible point and the desirableness of depending less upon supplies brought from Europe will soon induce the foreign authorities to stir in the matter." Commodore Perry's opinion on the desirability of an American protectorate over Formosa has already been stated. There was in Canton at that time an old friend of Parker's, Gideon Nye, Jr., whose firm had recently failed for a very large sum of money. Nye was now looking about for ways to recoup his fortunes. Formosa had been forced upon Mr. Nye's attention a few years before when the American ship Kelpie, carrying his brother, had sailed homeward from Canton only to be wrecked off the rocky coast of Formosa, and there had been no survivors. For years, the rumor persisted in Canton and Hong Kong that the survivors had been cast ashore on Formosa and then captured and held in slavery by some savage Formosan tribe. Indeed, one of the objects of the visit of the Dolphin to Formosa in 1849 had been to search for the survivors of the Kelpie. The visit of Commodore Perry to the island in 1854 had stimulated anew the interest of the Americans, and a commercial company consisting of an American firm, Robinette, a Peruvian naval officer who had become an American citizen in a somewhat informal way, and Gideon Nye had been formed to exploit the trade from a point called Apes Hill. Robinette and Nye made explorations and secured a monopoly of the camphor trade and the privilege of an establishment at Takao, in return for which the traders had agreed to pay $100 tonnage duties on each ship and to protect Takao from pirates. Improvements had been made to the extent of $45,000, and the American flag had been raised at the entrance to the harbor. More recently, the natives had become dissatisfied, and the traders had been obliged to threaten them with forcible measures if they did not act faithfully. As a result of these measures, the American company had become pretty much independent of the authorities. Nye and Robinette, realizing that it might be difficult to secure the occupation of the island by American naval forces, and that there were few precedents for what they desired, rather timidly suggested that they were perfectly willing, provided they were assured of the approval and protection of the American government, to set up an independent government in Formosa. Parker was very hospitable to the idea. Perhaps he was the more eager because he already knew that the privilege of revising the treaty was not to be for him, and that his days in China were already numbered. Here was the opportunity for one grand stroke. On February 12, 1857, he wrote to the State Department, enclosing Nye's proposition. The subject of Formosa is becoming one of great interest to a number of our enterprising fellow citizens, and deserves more consideration from the great commercial nations of the West than it has yet received, and it is much to be hoped that the government of the United States may not shrink from the action which the interests of humanity, civilization, navigation, and commerce impose upon it in relation to Taiwan, particularly the southeastern portion of it, at present inhabited by savages, to whose depraved cruelties we have every reason to believe many Europeans, and among them our own friends and countrymen, have fallen victims. Parker drew attention to his dispatch of December 12th, for which there had not yet been time for an answer, and solicited the earnest consideration of the President. The more Parker meditated upon the subject of Formosa, the more his imagination kindled. 10 days after sending the dispatch of February 12th, becoming impatient lest delay might be fatal to the destinies of the United States in Formosa, Parker hastily summoned Commodore Armstrong from Hong Kong to Macau for a conference on this subject of great delicacy, and it may be of vast importance to the United States in particular and to the Western nations generally. Parker wrote that he had reasons for feeling that if anything was to be done, it must be done quickly. The Commodore came to Macau with all speed. He had a kindred spirit in the matter, but had been rendered perhaps a little more cautious by the fact that no official approval for having destroyed the barrier forts 3 months before had as yet been received. What proposition Parker brought forward at the conference is not stated, but its nature may be inferred from the memoranda of the conference. After having read that portion of Parker's dispatch of December 12th, which referred to Formosa, Armstrong agreed with Parker on the following points. 1. The measure would be justified by the acknowledged principles of international law. 2. The claims and grievances then pending with the Chinese government amply justified reprisals. 3. Formosa was a most desirable island and would be particularly valuable to the United States. 4. But that its immediate occupation was impracticable with the present naval force in view of the possibility that the Chinese government might oppose it. It was admitted that in any other country than China the measure would be regarded as a virtual dissolution of avowed amicable relations. The Commodore agreed, however, that Parker had done his duty, and if the United States failed to acquire the island, the fault would not be upon the shoulders of the Commissioner. Parker followed his already numerous dispatches on Formosa with another marked confidential, March 10, 1857, in which even more impatiently he urged action. He had by then forgotten entirely that part of his original proposal which concerned the immediate restoration of the island to China the moment satisfaction might be obtained. Now he wrote, in event of the establishment of a line of steamers between California, Japan, and China, this source of supply of coal will be most advantageous. That the islands may not long remain a portion of the empire is possible, and in the event of its being severed from the empire politically, as it is geographically, that the United States should possess it is obvious, particularly as respects the great principle of the balance of power. And then the Commissioner surrendered to his imagination completely. Great Britain has her St. Helena in the Atlantic, her Gibraltar and Malta in the Mediterranean, her Aden in the Red Sea, Mauritius, Ceylon, Penang, and Singapore in the Indian Ocean, and Hong Kong in the China Sea. If the United States is so disposed and can arrange for the possession of Formosa, England certainly cannot object. As to just cause for occupying the island, Parker, smarting under 25 years' experience of being called a foreign devil, found ample grounds. If there ever was a state which has laid herself open to just reprisals, it is China. which has refused to fulfill a perfect obligation which she has contracted with the United States, and does not permit them to enjoy rights which they claim under the solemn stipulations of treaty, and in event of her persisting in this course, it seems clear that by the acknowledged principles of international law, the United States have the right, if they have the inclination, to take Formosa by way of reprisal until a satisfactory reparation should be made for injuries they have sustained. See Wheaton's International Law, page 362. Much reading of international law since the eye doctor became the diplomat had made Dr. Parker a little mad. He assured the Secretary of State that he had made up his mind to exercise his full powers to revise the treaty and adjust all claims, and to refer the matter to Washington for approval or disavowal, but intimated that he had been unable to carry Commodore Armstrong with the logic of the case. The weeks sped by, and yet the commissioner might expect no answer to even his first dispatch on Formosa for at least another couple of months. Meanwhile, the British Admiral at Hong Kong applied to Robinette, March 21st, for information about Formosa, and during the conversation remarked, "This island ought not to be allowed to exist in the hands of such a people which cannot control even the cannibals of the eastern part who murder our wrecked seamen." Admiral Seymour then asked Robinette if he had any objection to permitting an English naval officer to come to his establishment to live a while and observe conditions. Robinette asked for time to consider the matter and quickly notified Dr. Parker. The American commissioner immediately addressed Sir John Bowring a solemn protest on behalf of the United States government against England's taking possession of Formosa. In event of the island of Formosa being severed politically from the Empire of China, declared the commissioner, I trust to be able to substantiate a priority of claim to it on the part of the United States. First, by contracts already entered into with the imperial authorities of the island by citizens of the United States, and secondly, by their actual settlement upon it with the consent of the Chinese, over which the United States flag has been hoisted for more than a year. I embrace this opportunity to acquaint your Excellency that it is my full conviction that the government of the United States is disposed to adopt the same policy in China as is represented by your Excellency to be that of Great Britain, i.e., not to establish any exclusive rights or privileges. Sir John Bowring replied immediately, disavowing any designs on Formosa, and somewhat sharply making Parker a distinct proposition for a more pressing task: the occupation by the combined American, French, and English forces of the city of Canton. Parker was quite unable to accept such a distinct proposition, because he had no more authority for it than he had for the then existing American flag in Formosa. Probably Bowring knew this when he made the proposal. Parker, so intent on his project in the island, quite failed to catch the twinkle in Sir John's eye when he added to his disavowal, I hear for the first time officially that the United States flag has been hoisted for more than a year in that island. I can assure your Excellency I see without jealousy or annoyance the extension of American commerce in these regions, and will cordially support your Excellency in the attempt to give to it the strength and security of legality. Parker, apparently wholly lacking a sense of humor, hastened to show the letter to Commodore Armstrong, and expressed great satisfaction that thus the English minister was on record in the matter. Meanwhile, the Commodore had been reconsidering his decisions. There were still 2 months before instructions could be received from Washington. Armstrong knew that he was unable to occupy the island without express orders, but he was able to think of a way out of the dilemma. He proposed to Parker that he was willing to detach an officer from the squadron to go to Formosa and make another investigation for shipwrecked sailors, with instructions to keep his headquarters and flag at the premises of our countrymen, provided such an arrangement meets with your approval and sanction. The approval and sanction were not lacking, and Parker replied, I conceive that the settlement of our countrymen at Takao will afford the best facilities for making the investigation, and the fact of this officer being there holding his headquarters and flag may have an important bearing on the future. Disavowal by the American government. To the later and more impetuous proposals that he be given authority to complete the acquisition of Formosa, Dr. Parker never even received an answer from the Secretary of State, but to his original proposal that the three powers join in taking temporary possession of Korea, Chusan, and Formosa, he did receive the most unmistakable reply. In the closing days of the Pierce administration, Secretary of State Marcy wrote to Dr. Parker that the subject had already been submitted to the president by the French minister, and that the president did not believe that our relations with China warrant the last resort you speak of, and if they did, the military and naval forces of the United States could only be used by the authority of Congress. The last resort means war, and the executive branch of this government is not the war-making power. For the protection and security of Americans in China, and for the protection of their property, it may be expedient to increase our naval forces on the China station, but the President will not do it for aggressive purposes. In less than a week, the Buchanan administration came into office. William B. Reed was appointed minister to China, and Dr. Parker immediately dropped all preparations for his expedition to Formosa. The instructions to Minister Reed are most explicit in reply to all of Dr. Parker's proposals and to the ambitions of any Americans in China to acquire territory at the expense of the empire. This country, you will constantly bear in mind, is not at war with the government of China, nor does it seek to enter into that empire for any other purpose than those of lawful commerce, and for the protection of the lives and property of its citizens. The whole nature and policy of our government must necessarily confine our action within these limits, and deprive us of all motives either for territorial aggrandizement or the acquisition of political power in that distant region. You will not fail to let it be known to the Chinese authorities that we are no party to the existing hostilities and have no intention to interfere in their political concerns or to gain a foothold in their country. We go there to engage in trade, but under suitable guarantees for its protection. The extension of our commercial intercourse must be the work of individual enterprise, and to this element of our national character we may safely leave it. One may close this chapter of American history with a smile, and yet one is to remember it as an illustration of the fact that, contrary to popular impression, no bacillus has ever been introduced into the blood of Americans which renders them immune to imperialistic ambitions when others have the malady and when the commercial conditions favorable for the infection are present. However, with the issuance of the instructions to Minister Reed in 1857, the policy which had been proposed by Commodore Perry came definitely to an end, never to appear again until the day, more than 40 years later, when President McKinley cabled to the American commissioners at Paris to demand the cession of the Philippines to the United States. Dr. Parker's policy had not been complicated or subtle and requires no analysis. He belonged to the Perry school of Asiatic policy.